What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
Some of us actually work for a living, Dean muttered with that smug, shit-eating grin he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. His eyes locked directly on mine across the dinner table like he was waiting for the punchline to land. And I knew right then he wanted a reaction, maybe a flinch, a flash of embarrassment, some twitch of insecurity to confirm what he's always believed about me, that I was all show and no grit, all talk and no scars. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just kept cutting into my ham like I hadn't heard him, like his opinion was nothing more than the sound of an engine coughing down the road. And that's when Grandma, sitting between us like the Queen of Quiet Wars, leaned back in her chair, pulled out a folded-up copy of the Herald Business Weekly from the side pocket of her walker, and set it on the table with the deliberate precision of someone placing a loaded weapon in plain sight. She didn't say a word. Just tapped the front page with her crooked, weathered finger, right on the photo of me standing outside my firm's New York office in a navy blue blazer and heels that had cost more than Dean's entire work truck. The headline read, "Strategic Powerhouse: How Harper Grace is Rewriting Rural Business Models for the Next Generation." And I swear to God, the way Dean's jaw clicked shut, the silence in the room got heavy enough to press against your lungs. He coughed once, picked up his beer, and stared down into it like it might hold some explanation for what just happened. No one said anything for a good 20 seconds, and in a Marshall family gathering, that's a full-blown eternity. It's funny, isn't it? How the past never stays buried. You can shovel years of silence and politeness over it, layer it with new clothes, new jobs, new cities, new smiles for Christmas photos, but it finds a way to rise through the cracks when you least expect it, usually at Grandma June's dining table, under the yellow light of that dusty chandelier that's been there since the Nixon administration. Dean wasn't just taking a shot at me. He was defending a life he had to justify every day. Born and raised in this county, same as me. Except he stayed. Took over his dad's contracting business, married a woman who aged 10 years faster than she should have, had 2 sons with the same attitude and none of the discipline. Every time I came back, I saw it in his eyes, that mix of resentment and shame he would never name. To him, I was the traitor. The one who ran off, went soft behind a desk, never had dirt under my fingernails or a bad back from lifting drywall. But he didn't know the half of it. Because what Dean never understood, and still doesn't, is that I never left to escape the hard work. I left because I knew exactly how hard it would be to stay and live among people who'd already written your story for you. People who, after my father's death, decided the Grace name meant failure. Lazy ambition. Empty promises. But none of them had the full story. Not even Grandma. After dinner, once the dishes had been cleared and the homemade peach cobbler had been dissected down to crumbs, I offered to stay and help Grandma tidy up. Dean muttered something about having a job site in the morning and took off with his wife and boys, leaving behind the smell of stale beer and wounded pride. Grandma didn't say much as we wiped down the counters and put away the leftover ham, but her eyes kept glancing toward my suitcase by the hallway. "You didn't just come here for my birthday," she finally said, her back turned to me as she rinsed a serving spoon under the faucet. "Did you?" I paused, towel in hand, wondering for a second whether she had guessed it all. But I kept my voice level and shrugged like it was nothing. "Wanted to check on the place," I said. "Haven't been back since." "Since the auction," she finished for me. And just like that, the air in the kitchen turned sharp. That auction. The one where they sold off my father's tools, his ledgers, even the barn doors after the fire took the rest. The one where Uncle Rick, Dean's father, stood at the edge of the crowd pretending not to know the man who'd once built a business with him from the ground up. The one where Dean, barely 21 back then, had the nerve to place the final bid on my father's land, our land, and walked away with it for less than the cost of a new pickup. I didn't say any of that to Grandma. Instead, I gave her a tired smile and said goodnight. Upstairs, I unpacked slowly, careful not to make noise on those creaky old floorboards. At the bottom of my suitcase, tucked beneath a layer of carefully folded sweaters, was a manila envelope marked Marshall vs. Grace, 1997. Inside were photocopies of court records, forged signatures, land transfer forms, and something else. A single yellowed photograph of my father and Uncle Rick shaking hands in front of the old Grace and Marshall storage barn before it mysteriously burned down. That photo was dated 3 days before the fire. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that photo, the past burning in the back of my throat like old whiskey. This time, I hadn't come to make peace. This time, I'd come to collect. And I wasn't leaving empty-handed. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful or comforting. It stretches across a room like a shadow and settles in your chest like a weight, and that was exactly the kind of silence I sat in the next morning at Grandma June's kitchen table, staring out the window at the edge of the backyard where the barn used to stand, the one my father built with his own hands before the fire stripped it down to black beams and smoldering ash. The frame had long since been cleared, the debris hauled off and buried in some county dump site, but the outlines still haunted the soil like a ghost, a square of scorched earth that refused to forget, even as the grass tried to reclaim it. Grandma didn't speak when she walked in and set a chipped ceramic mug of coffee in front of me, just gave me a knowing glance, as if she too had spent the night wrestling with memories she'd never speak aloud. As if the simple act of waking up in this house had pulled both of us back into a story we'd tried, in our own ways, to outrun. I knew from the moment I crossed the county line that I wasn't here just to stir old ghosts or wave my success in Dean's face, no matter how satisfying that moment at the table had been. The truth, buried under 2 decades of half-truths and swallowed anger, was that I had unfinished business here, and it went deeper than inheritance or family pride. What I was after wasn't revenge in the petty, dramatic sense. It was clarity, accountability, and, if the world had any justice left, the reclamation of what had always been mine by birth and stolen through lies. And to get there, I needed facts, not memories, not assumptions, not Grandma's raised eyebrow and Dean's venomous smirks, but concrete, legally recognized facts that tied everything together in a way no one could deny. That's why, 2 hours later, I found myself walking into the Franklin County Clerk's office with a polite smile stretched across my face like armor, a blazer sharp enough to remind them I wasn't some drifting local cousin in town for pie and nostalgia, and a quiet, focused rage tucked just behind my ribcage. I knew the woman behind the glass. Her name was Denise, and she used to play softball with my mother back in the 70s, so I leaned in just enough to seem friendly, but not so much that she'd start asking too many questions, and with one quick mention of looking up property records for the old Grace parcel, her fingers were already clacking across the keyboard. What I hadn't expected, what I hadn't wanted to expect, because part of me still hoped this would all be something I'd imagined, was the way her face changed when she pulled up the files, the way her eyebrows drew together like she was reading something she didn't quite believe. And then she turned the screen toward me without a word, just let the document speak for itself, a recent property transfer, dated only 3 months ago, signed and notarized, officially handing over the remainder of what had once been Grace Family Holdings. Now parceled off and renamed Marshall Enterprises LLC, with one name listed under the controlling interest, Dean Marshall. It didn't make sense, not immediately, because as far as I'd known, that land had been in some kind of legal limbo for years, left untouched after the fire, disputed quietly between what was left of our 2 family branches, never built on, never sold. Never even discussed out loud except in cautious whispers and behind clenched teeth during holidays. And yet here it was, black and white, ink on digital paper. My cousin had somehow gotten it all, signed it, sealed it, and filed it right under everyone's nose, including Grandma's. I thanked Denise, took a printout of the documents, trying to keep my hands from shaking as I folded them neatly into my bag and walked out into the sun with a sense of something clicking into place, not in a pleasant or satisfying way, but like hearing the lock turn on a door you didn't even know you were trapped behind. There had to be more to it, because Dean never moved unless he was sure the cards were already stacked in his favor, and if he'd done this, he hadn't done it alone. Someone helped him. Someone handed him the keys. And the only person left alive who had that kind of power was the same woman who'd slipped me a newspaper under the table without saying a word, Grandma June. Back at the house, I found her sitting in her chair on the porch, a blanket across her knees despite the heat, her eyes trained not on the yard but on the sky, as if she was listening to something far away. I didn't ask her about the transfer. Not yet. Instead, I handed her the manila envelope I'd brought with me from New York, the one filled with all the documents I'd been gathering for the past 6 months, copies of the fire marshal's report, the insurance payout history, the legal correspondence between my father and Uncle Rick's lawyer before the lawsuit was quietly dropped after his heart attack, and, most importantly, a copy of a signed statement from a now-retired notary who claimed he'd been pressured into backdating a deed sometime in the spring of 1997. She took the folder with her usual calm, opened it without hesitation, and flipped through the pages slowly, methodically, like she was confirming something she already suspected but had never wanted to see in writing. And when she reached the notary's statement, she didn't speak, just gave the faintest sigh and said, "Well, I always figured Rick was crooked, but I didn't think he'd teach the boy how to forge signatures before he could shave." I asked her how Dean had gotten the land, how the transfer went through, how the county clerk hadn't flagged any of it, and she looked at me with a tired sort of patience and said, "Because I gave him permission. I didn't sign it, but I didn't stop it either. Thought maybe it'd be better to let him carry the shame than let you carry the anger." That made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly her, trying to balance the scales without letting anyone see which hand was heavier. I stood there on that porch, the scent of honeysuckle rising from the edge of the fence line, and felt something cold and hard settle into place inside me. She had let it happen. Dean had taken what he never earned. And now, after all this time, it was mine to reclaim. And I didn't need a courtroom to do it. Just the truth, a plan, and the right moment to flip the board. The thing no one tells you about vengeance, true vengeance, the kind that simmers for decades rather than exploding in the moment, is that it's never about the explosion itself. It's about the slow burn, the tightening grip of inevitability. The gradual shifting of pieces until the person who thought they held all the power finds themselves surrounded by consequences they didn't even see coming. That's the game I was playing now, not out of spite, not entirely, but because I had learned, through years of watching people underestimate me, that the sharpest blade in the room is the one no one realizes is already pressed against their neck. For the next few days, I played the part everyone expected me to play. I helped Grandma fold laundry that didn't really need folding. I drove her to the post office and the pharmacy. I nodded and smiled while neighbors I hadn't seen in 20 years talked to me like I was a guest actor in their local soap opera, someone whose presence was curious, but not consequential. I let Dean think he'd won. I even complimented the new siding he'd slapped onto Grandma's garage, knowing damn well he'd overcharged her for it last summer under the guise of family rates. He grinned like the wolf who'd just been offered another sheep, told me he was glad to see I'd come back down to earth, and made some offhand remark about how the city softens people, how it's good to touch real things again. I smiled right back, sweet as pie, while inside my head I was rearranging every single one of his assumptions like furniture before an estate sale. Because while he was talking, I was listening. Every boast, every half-truth, every little hint of something he didn't mean to let slip, especially the part where he mentioned, too casually, that he'd finally cleared out that old unit off County Road 12, said it like it was an errand, like it meant nothing. But the second I heard it, my brain lit up like a match hitting dry straw. That unit used to be Grace and Marshall Storage, the original building my father and Uncle Rick co-owned before everything burned. Most folks assumed it had been demolished or sold off years ago, but I'd always suspected it was just sitting there, forgotten by everyone except the man who knew it still held secrets. So, the next morning, I took Grandma's old pickup, the blue one she kept for sentimental reasons, which happened to have no GPS and a tape deck that only played gospel music. And I drove out to County Road 12 under the excuse of picking up fresh tomatoes from a roadside stand. The unit was still there, half swallowed by overgrown grass and time, its sign faded and flaking, but the lock was new, shiny even. And that was enough. I didn't try to break in. That wasn't the kind of revenge I was after. No, I just needed confirmation, and Dean, bless his overconfident little heart, had given it to me. When I got back to the house, I sat down with Grandma on the porch again, both of us pretending not to be playing chess with each other's memories. I told her what I'd seen, described the lock, the condition of the building, the location of the mailbox out front still bearing the original Grace and Marshall nameplate. And she didn't even blink. Just sipped her tea and said, "Your daddy kept all the good records in that unit. Rick thought burning the barn meant the end of the trail, but your daddy wasn't stupid. He never trusted that man fully, even before things soured." That was all I needed to hear. The trap was ready. All I had to do was bait it. The next day, I made my move. I called Dean from the kitchen phone on purpose, because I knew he'd see the caller ID and assume I was too old school to use a smartphone, and asked to meet him for coffee, just to catch up. He showed up 30 minutes late, reeking of paint thinner and ego, sat across from me at the only diner in town that didn't water down its coffee, and immediately launched into a monologue about how he was expanding the business, how the boys were finally stepping up, how not everyone has time to sit around writing emails and looking pretty for magazines. I let him talk, watched his mouth move without really hearing the words, and waited for the exact right moment to mention, as casually as I could, that I was thinking about investing back into the community, maybe even reviving the Grace family brand in some way. That got his attention. He leaned in a little, the way people do when their pride collides with their paranoia, and asked what exactly I meant. I told him I was thinking about reopening the storage business, maybe building a logistics center where the old barn stood. Told him I'd already gotten a verbal interest from a couple of distributors upstate. Watched the blood drain from his face 1 inch at a time. He covered it well, at least he thought he did, but I saw the twitch in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes. He knew I was serious. And he knew I was stepping too close to something he'd tried to bury. I offered him a partnership. On paper, it sounded generous. I even said I'd invest the money, he'd run the construction, we'd split the profit. I told him I had a basic draft of the contract in my bag, and if he wanted to take a look, we could sign a non-binding letter of intent just to see where things went. He didn't hesitate. Didn't even read the fine print. Just signed and slapped the pen down like he was sealing another victory. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't have realized, is that the document he signed didn't just give me permission to look at the Grace and Marshall records. It gave me legal access to the property. All I needed. 2 days later, I was standing inside that storage unit with a locksmith I paid out of pocket and who owed me a favor from a case I'd quietly helped settle 4 years ago. The door creaked open like a confession being pulled out of someone's throat, and the air inside was thick with dust, mildew, and the kind of secrets that rot when left too long in the dark. What I found inside didn't shock me, it confirmed everything. Blueprints. Ledger books. A fire marshal's assessment with handwritten notes from my father in the margins. Receipts for insurance policy changes filed only weeks before the fire. But the thing that made me sit down, right there on the concrete floor, wasn't paper. It was a cassette tape. Labeled in my father's handwriting. Just one word on the label, Rick. I held it like it might disintegrate in my hand, heart pounding not from fear but from the slow, pulsing thrill of the truth finally dragging itself to the surface after all these years. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But I finally had the leverage I needed. Now it was just a matter of deciding how loud I wanted to make the fall. There is a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing something others believe you are incapable of understanding, a slow-burning pride in holding a card no one suspects you possess, especially when it was earned not through deception or manipulation, but through patience, hard, grueling, thankless patience that most people confuse for weakness, especially men like Dean who mistake noise for strength and dominance for leadership. As I sat alone in the upstairs guest room of Grandma June's house, the cassette tape clutched in my hand and the dusty evidence from that old storage unit spread across the bed like a battlefield map, I could feel, for the first time in 20 years, the pieces clicking into place, not with the explosive drama of a courtroom victory or the grand finale of a revenge movie, but with the quiet, undeniable finality of something long overdue finally stepping into the light. I didn't rush to play the tape, not because I was afraid of what was on it, but because I already knew, deep down, that whatever was recorded on that ribbon of magnetic film would confirm what I had spent half my life piecing together from scraps of overheard conversations, sideways glances, and the bitter silence that surrounded my father's name like a shroud. I wanted to hear it, yes, but I wanted it to matter more than just to me. I wanted it to be used, deployed, weaponized. But before I could do anything, I needed to make sure that when I pulled the trigger, there would be no recoil I couldn't absorb. I wasn't naive. I'd built a career anticipating reactions, forecasting blowback, planning around risk, and I knew better than to think Dean would simply roll over the moment I confronted him with the truth. Men like Dean don't crumble from guilt, they lash out from fear. And fear is exactly what I needed him to feel. So, the next day, I started laying the groundwork, not just for his fall, but for my return. My public return to a town that had always spoken about me in the past tense, like I was some unfinished project abandoned halfway through construction. I met with the county zoning office under the pretense of looking into redevelopment opportunities for the Grace parcel. Strictly exploratory, I said, just a preliminary conversation about logistics and feasibility. The clerk, a man in his late 50s with a gut shaped like a beer keg and a surprisingly detailed knowledge of county codes, was more than happy to explain that the land hadn't been rezoned in over 30 years, and that any significant commercial construction would require a new review, especially if the ownership was still tied up in limited liability partnerships or, his words, not mine, legacy deeds with murky chains of custody. I smiled, thanked him, and asked for a complete record of the parcel's history, which he handed over. Without a second thought, unaware that the woman in front of him already knew half of what he was telling her and was only there to confirm the rest. From there, I visited the local bank, yes, the same one where Dean kept his construction accounts, and sat down with an old acquaintance named Tanya who used to braid my hair during slumber parties and now managed small business lending. I told her I was considering investing in a logistics hub, potentially hiring local contractors, maybe even bringing in a few city consultants to upgrade the area's infrastructure. I didn't mention Dean's name. I didn't need to. I just waited for her to mention it herself, and of course, she did. You know, Dean's been poking around trying to do something similar, she said, her voice low, like she was handing me a secret that tasted like gossip but felt like strategy. He's been applying for permits, but the paperwork's been sloppy. No real investor backing. Lot of noise. Not much plan. Exactly what I needed to hear. That night, back at the house, I pulled the old tape recorder out from the bottom of Grandma's linen closet. It was still there, just where I remembered it from my childhood, tucked behind a stack of perfectly folded pillowcases. I pressed play with a finger that trembled only slightly, and then I sat down and listened. The audio was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. Uncle Rick's slow, drawling cadence filled the room, followed by Dean's younger, sharper tone. They were talking numbers at first, insurance, materials, cleanup costs, which was already a red flag, but then the conversation shifted, and it turned darker, more deliberate. You torch the barn, Rick said, and make sure it's clean, no strays, no leaks. I'll handle the paperwork, and nobody'll ask questions, especially not after what happened with Harper's old man. And then Dean replied, if he gets in the way, we'll say he left the door unlocked. They already think he's slipping. The tape ended with the sound of laughter, casual, unbothered, like two men clinking beer bottles after a job well done. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even stand up. I just sat there, watching the tape spin back into its casing, and realized that my father had never stood a chance, not against betrayal, not against men who planned his downfall like a construction job. And now Dean had no idea I was holding that history in my hand, no idea that the past he'd buried with insurance paperwork and small-town charm was about to resurface with legal teeth and professional precision. I spent the next 2 days finalizing the paperwork for a new LLC under the Grace name, listing Grandma as a silent majority shareholder and myself as acting manager. I had a lawyer from Buffalo draft a memorandum of understanding, tying the land use rights back into the original Grace deed through a series of reversion clauses that could unravel Dean's bogus claim like a spool of bad yarn if challenged properly. I also had him write up a binding service contract for a general contractor, one that looked very much like the kind Dean's company would jump at without reading the fine print. Then I baited the hook. I invited Dean to lunch, said I had a real offer this time, that the investors were ready, that I'd managed to secure legacy funding through a historic restoration grant and needed someone local to manage the job. He showed up in a button-down shirt and scuffed boots, smelling faintly of drywall dust and too much cologne, and barely let me finish my pitch before agreeing to the terms. Said it was nice to finally be taken seriously. He signed the agreement right there in the booth, between bites of brisket, and didn't ask a single question. He had no idea that, by signing it, he'd given me full access to every file in his construction archive, every invoice, every permit, every subcontractor license, and misfiled tax document. All of it, now legally required to pass through my office for compliance review. And somewhere in all those files, I knew I'd find the missing pieces, the proof of fraud, the payments that didn't match, the falsified claims, the subcontractors who never got paid, the money that vanished after the fire. I was no longer just gathering evidence. I was laying the foundation for a controlled demolition. And when it came down, there would be no warning signs. Only the sound of everything Dean had built collapsing under the weight of what he stole. There's a peculiar kind of stillness that descends on a person when the final piece of a long-brewing plan locks into place. Not the frantic rush of triumph, not the noisy chaos of confrontation, but a slow, deliberate exhale. The kind that follows a marathon rather than a sprint, when every muscle in your body remembers what it costs to carry the weight and every part of your mind finally accepts that you are not the person who began the journey, because revenge, when done right, does not leave you unchanged. It carves you into something sharper, colder, and far more dangerous than you were when you started. I felt that stillness settle over me the morning I knew it was time to deliver the final blow, not because I wanted to see Dean suffer, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that did, but because I needed the truth to stop rotting in the ground where it had been buried, forgotten, and denied for too long by people who told themselves that silence was a form of survival. The tape, the contracts, the deed history, the insurance fraud evidence, even the notarized affidavit from a former clerk who admitted, under pressure from a subpoena threat I'd never even filed, that Rick Marshall had slipped him a bottle of bourbon and $100 bill to expedite some revisions after the fire. All of it was lined up now, packaged neatly in a secure file marked Grace vs. Marshall, confidential, ready to be activated with one email to the county attorney's office, one call to the state contractor board, one quiet conversation with a business journalist I had on speed dial from a merger I advised on 3 years ago. And yet, as I stood at the edge of the pasture behind Grandma's house that morning, watching the fog lift off the dew-covered grass in slow, ghostly sheets, I felt no rush to move. I wanted Dean to sweat a little longer. I wanted him to feel the walls start closing in before he even knew what door he'd left open. He made it easy. The very same afternoon, as if fate had a cruel sense of theatrical timing, he stormed up the porch with a half-crumpled copy of the contract he'd signed 2 weeks earlier, flinging it onto the patio table between me and Grandma with all the grace of a man who finally realized he'd been outplayed in a game he thought he invented. His voice was raised before he even sat down, railing about how he'd talked to his guy, how there were loopholes and oversights, how I'd tricked him into thinking this was a family opportunity when all I really wanted was to take him down in public. Grandma didn't say a word at first. She just sat back in her rocking chair, hands folded over her stomach, eyes fixed on the horizon like she'd already seen how this would end long before either of us were born. And when Dean finally turned to her, pleading for backup in that familiar, whining tone he always used when things didn't go his way, "She's trying to ruin me, Grandma. You gonna let her do this to family?" It was her silence that hit hardest, the way she let the moment hang between us like an old song we all knew the words to but hadn't sung in years. When she did speak, it wasn't loud, but it cut sharper than anything I could have said. "You ruined yourself the day you decided to lie about what happened to your uncle," she said, not looking at him but at me, as if confirming aloud something I had known but never needed her to admit. I didn't stop you then because I thought maybe time would teach you better. But it didn't. And now Harper's just doing what I should have done a long time ago. Dean's face twisted into something between disbelief and disgust, like he couldn't quite accept that the one person he thought would always cover for him had just flipped sides. He pushed away from the table so fast his chair scraped the wood, muttering something about lawyers and lawsuits and how he wouldn't go down without a fight, but I didn't rise to it. I didn't need to, because I had already won. He just hadn't realized it yet. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Grandma had gone to bed, I sat in the den with the lights off, watching the cassette tape spin in the recorder one last time, not for verification, but for closure. The sound of Rick and Dean planning the fire, laughing about my father's vulnerability, talking about how the idiot didn't even know the insurance terms got changed, it no longer filled me with rage or grief. It just confirmed what I'd always suspected. They'd never seen him as a partner, only as a stepping stone, a name to piggyback on until it no longer served their purpose. And Dean, inheriting not just the business, but the rot that came with it, had grown up believing that strength meant stepping on whoever was closest, as long as no one dared look down to see the bodies under his feet. I made 3 copies of the tape. One I left with my attorney. One I mailed anonymously, of course, to the state licensing board with a brief cover letter. And the last I placed inside a sealed envelope marked "in the event of my death" and handed to Grandma with no explanation. She didn't ask for one. Just nodded, tucked it into the old cedar box under her bed, and told me I'd always had my father's eyes, but I'd learned to use them better. The next morning, before I left town, I took one last drive past the old Grace property. The sign at the end of the dirt road no longer said Marshall and Sons. At some point, probably in the early morning while the rest of the town still slept, someone had replaced it with a new placard, wood, sanded clean, painted in bold black letters. Grace Legacy Ranch. No fanfare. No announcement. Just quiet reclamation. And yet, even as I sat there in the car, engine idling, the sense of triumph that should have surged through me didn't arrive the way I expected. Instead, I felt something else, something heavier, more complicated, like the residue of a storm that had taken years to gather and minutes to unleash. I'd taken back what was mine. I'd exposed the lies. I'd rewritten the narrative. And still, there was no real sense of peace. Just a silence that felt earned. In the end, I didn't destroy Dean. I didn't have to. I let him destroy himself, gave him just enough rope and watched him tie the knots, overconfident and blind to the fact that the woman he dismissed for so long had come back not to visit, but to finish what her father never could. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all, not the confrontation, not the fallout, but the fact that, in the quiet aftermath, when the dust settles and the truth is finally undeniable, the person who once looked down on you is forced to live with the weight of knowing they were outmatched, not by someone stronger, but by someone who never raised their voice. So, what would you have done? Would you have burned it all down, dragged him through court, made sure his name was smeared in every paper from here to Albany? Or would you have done what I did, outplayed, outmaneuvered, and left just enough mercy on the table for him to stew in his own shame? Because me? I chose the long game. And I'm still playing it.